City Under the Sea by Kenneth Bulmer. Prologue. The water was deep and black and cold. Caught in the grip of crushing pressure, the water scarcely moved above the pelagic ooze, its profundity embalming reason, its bulk covering a vast gloom, drowning a mysterious world of eternal night. The water thrust at the ooze of the ocean floor, and thrust again the bleak wall of the escarpment, rising in barren, fissured, soaring columns of rock. Mudfalls draped rocky clefts, like curtains, and spilled out in undulating fans. There was no colour here, only the everlasting blackness. Fissured and indented, the slopes of the scarp rose upwards in an unbroken, uninterrupted ascent, the longest continuous slopes in the world. Raking upwards at an ever-steepening incline from the ocean floor, 20,000 feet of lightless, plantless, virgin rock and mud supported and buttressed the continental shelf. Blackness unrelieved, and yet lights everywhere. Luminous motes of colour gliding and darting, poised, halting for a startled fragment of time, and then fleeing and disappearing, swooshing and glowing in fierce, brainless hunger-satisfied triumph. But now another source of light probed the depth. The bruised tag end of the spectrum imperceptibly created an encompassing blueness, and as the mass of water above thinned, the blueness grew, lightening through the spectrum, purling into a translucent twilight where the myriad lights from below flickered and faded with a spectral glimmer. The bluffs of the continental shelf puffed out their bulging chests into the waters, shouldering from blackness into opaline radiance. But they themselves were drowned beneath the skin of water, a film of moisture negligible by comparison with the unplumbed depth below, but a film with merciless fingers of constricting pressure. Under that pressure, strung along the very edge of the shelf, a chain of softly glowing pearls gleamed with a steady radiance. Each dome sent out its welcome beams of light, visible reminders in that cruel undersea world of comfort and warmth and rest. In the watery and visible atmosphere, the domes glowed like a diadem of stars. There is movement around the domes. Shining forms, sparkling and glittering scales in the light, streamlined bodies, waving, glinting fins. Fish by the billions. Schools of fish, colleagues of fish, whole universities twisting and turning, and yet moving with strangely ordered purpose. With all their swimming to and fro, their playful scurryings, their gobblings for food, their sudden inexplicable surges, they never stray beyond the limits of the shelf, never seek to explore the blue depths beneath. And above them, as the water pales ever greener and mellower, and begins subtly to move in answer to other forces than those low, agonized creepings of drowned currents, there are more fish, civilizations of fish, both large and small, all responding in some mysterious way to an overriding, controlling force. set forward on a jutting cliff that stands out like some sentinel finger from the undersea shelf. There hovers over rock and ooze only darkness, where surely there should be another link of light ringing the edge of the scarp. Fragmentary shadows flicker in the water. Lonely lights curve sharply, veer away. Into the twilight dimension seeps a murky cloud. A rolling cloud that is out of keeping with the crystalline liquid atmosphere. Sounds shatter the silence of the depths. Mutterings and flutings, the involuntary whistles of fish and the sharp, hard pinging of sonic waves. Shining bubbles rise and burst. The dome is silent and dead. Shapes clash and struggle around it. Giant jaws open wide. Puny figures struggle. Figures unfish-like in this world of pitiless ferocity and unknowing cruelty. Figures with 4 spindly, inefficient appendages in the place of powerful, streamlined fins and tail. Tiny figures that have no place in this undersea world of darkness and cold and death. Chapter 1. The spaceport was crowded. The monorail was crowded. The streets bulged. Flyovers creaked under pressing humanity. It took him 10 minutes before he could dial a taxi. The hotel lobby was crowded. The lift was crowded. There were just too many damned people. That was the trouble with Earth, of course. Nothing new in the thought. But coming back after 10 years in space, it sort of hit him in the eye. With just one person sitting, waiting demurely by the window. The way he was feeling even in his motel room was crowded. She wasn't the type to be overlooked. She attracted a crowd. She crowded your attentions, and she more than crowded the shocking pink Orlan tube sweater. She stood up gracefully, with the fluid motion that, under the full effects of one-hole gravity, he was still finding difficult, and turned to face him smiling. Commander Jeremy Dodge. Her voice was pleasant and smooth, and yet, in his frame of mind, still linked embarrassingly with the strident hum of the city. That's right. He waited for her to go on. She made a little gesture with her left hand, the square-cut nails gleaming. I'm Elise Tarrant, Mr. Grosvenor's private secretary. She said it as though it explained everything. Dodge said, This Grosvenor, when do I meet him? He put his grip on the end of the bed. He drags me off furlough, and believe me, Miss Tarrant, anyone who can persuade me to give up a mountaineering holiday on the moon is a grade A persuader, and cajoles me down the earth. I'm in rather a hurry. If you'd... This is why I'm here, Commander. She was coolly amused. Dodge saw, and that made him feel uncomfortably small, which made him annoyed. It looked as though this self-possessed young lady had the power to shatter his composure. He drew his eyebrows down. Mr. Grosvenor asked me particularly to apologize for your holiday, but he feels that what he has to tell you will more than compensate. She paused, and then, with an air of gravity that caught Dodge's full attention, said, It's such a big thing, really big. I mean, that your whole life will be altered. Dodge grunted. They told me that when we went on the first Jovian expedition. She made a little mew of disgust. So many billions that even the UN Treasury hasn't told me the full story yet. And for your 6 little balls of eternally frozen mud. You don't think much of Space Force, do you? I think you're all heroes, sure. But I think that you get too much applause and too much money and too many medals. Well, it's nice to know. She caught her upper lip between her teeth. Dodge noticed how red the lips, how white the teeth. That pleased him in an obscure way. The Vero-coloured makeup, flaunted by women he had seen on his brief journey from the spaceport to the hotel, had sickened rather than attracted him. The pace of the modern world was so hectic that even 10 tiny years could witness changes of astounding magnitude. She released the lip with a gesture of decision. "I'm sorry, Commander. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that." She looked at him. "You'll have a better idea of how I feel when you've talked to Mr. Grosvenor and seen around." She stopped talking with such force that for a moment to Dodge it was like falling over a precipice of sound. Then she went on. But that quiet voice was even now struggling to hold down some strong emotion. "If you're ready, Commander, we can start now." "Start?" Dodge said, really wondering about that strange change of subject, that sharp cutting off of what the girl had been saying. "Start where to?" "To see Mr. Grosvenor. He is staying at the Blue Deep Hotel. It'll take us about an hour." "An hour?" Dodge looked surprised. "Where is this hotel then? On the other side of the planet?" Then, thinking of the traffic and the crowds, he said sourly, "Or is it in the next block?" She smiled. It was a sunrise in the Spartan hotel room. Dodge began to see different angles to this enigmatic girl. He picked up his bag philosophically, prepared to play out this wild goose chase until he could hear the straight talk from the lips of the persuasive Grosvenor himself. The telephone rang. Dodge answered. "Yes, this is Commander Dodge speaking. Who is—" On the line there was a definite click as the receiver was replaced. Whoever had rung had merely confirmed that he was in the room, and then had rung off. Odd. Elise Tarrant was staring at him uncertainly. He laughed shortly and said, "Wrong number, I guess," and realized with a distinct sense of shock that he didn't think anything of the sort. And what was odder still, he knew with a curious certainty that the girl didn't think so either, and she knew that he knew she felt that. Elise crinkled up her nose, refusing to comment further, and Dodge picked up his bag and they left the room together. The electronic lock hummed cheerfully to itself as the door closed. Dodge was happy to escape into the hissing maw of the underground. At least there, the atmosphere was air-conditioned and breathable. They hadn't got round to air-conditioning the streets yet, between the webwork of flyovers and vertical window-pierced cliffs, and the air there just wasn't breathable. Not by the standards of a spaceman who lived off canned air and algae-produced oxygen all his life. The idea of algae tanks for city-wide air conditioning, suspended from every crossover, attracted him fleetingly. It was the sort of wacky idea that Dodgers could be relied on to dream up in any idle moment. The coast-hugging network of undersea farms would do well out of it, producing algae on an even greater scale than they now did for food processing and the Space Force's uses. His Uncle Arthur had gone in for that aquaculture racket, and last he'd heard of him, and oddly, it was about Uncle Arthur that Grosvenor fellow wanted to talk. Be just like the old villain to have his pile ploughing up the sea bottom and herding fish and milking. Well, he hadn't yet arranged to milk fishes, against nature or something. And anyway, all these undersea ventures, the mile-deep oil wells and coal mines, the intense cultivation of seaweeds and adapted marine plants, the solid shoals of fish herded about the seas like cattle, all of them seemed to have a cloak of semi-mystery flung about them, which a returning spaceman like Dodge just wouldn't bother his head about. The train snaked almost silently beneath the city, carrying them out beyond the park-like suburbs and the ring of factory areas. Dodge leaned forward on the cushioned seat. "Can you tell me anything of what this is all about?" he said pleasantly. "Grosvenor mentioned my Uncle Arthur and intimated that he was connected some way. Are you familiar with this? Well," he paused helplessly, and then said with a half-humorous chuckle, "With this case?" She nodded. "I am, fully. But Mr. Grosvenor expressly wishes to talk to you personally." It wouldn't be any good if I... No, I thought not." Dodge sat back. He crossed one knee over the other and flicked his immaculate Space Navy blacks into a leading edge crease. From almost a lifetime in the Space Force, since his parents had died and he had replaced them with his ideals of a man's place out between the stars, his memory of Uncle Arthur, based on the half-dozen awkward meetings, was vivid. "Grosvenor said that Uncle Arthur had left me something, and I told him that all I expected was a bill for the drinks at the funeral. I told him I wasn't coming back to Earth just to collect a few thousand or a decaying house." He looked puzzled. "Grosvenor said it wasn't a few thousand and that the house was already decayed. What did he mean, Miss Tarrant?" "I'm sorry, I'm not at liberty to tell you." She sounded genuinely sorry too, Dodge realized. The train ran out of the tunnel, nosing upwards to the terminus. People were rising, gathering their belongings, moving for the doors. Just as Elise rose to her feet, she leaned forward, swaying slightly with the roll of the train, and Dodge, braced against his seat, felt the soft warmth of her body press for a heady moment against him. Then he heard her say something that came in vagrant wafts of sound through the thunder of the blood in his temples. "There is a great deal of injustice in this world. I mean real, brutal, callous criminal injustice. You'll see. You might be able to do something about it too." Then the train had stopped and the doors had opened, and people were streaming for the escalators, and all Dodge could think about was the way Elise had crushed into him. Space makes a man sensitive to these things. He stumbled along after her, pulling the black space bag free from the crowds, jamming the escalator, and began to mull over her words. Injustice. Well, he supposed there was, although he'd not experienced any, except perhaps when they'd passed him over the first time for lieutenant commander. But he had the idea that this strong-willed personality, thrusting ahead now, the shocking pink sweater the target for many wolfish eyes, wouldn't consider for a micro-fraction of a second that as an example of injustice. The terminus was a wide white sweep of concrete, flat-roofed and with serpentine supporting pillars. Through the frame thus formed Dodge saw a brilliance of sunshine that he blinked his eyes automatically. The air was crisp and biting, with a tang of ozone and bracing nippiness. They went with the crowd out and down the shallow steps, and there before him was the sea. It was the first time in his life that he had seen the sea like this, standing on a low cliff top, looking out across the white flecked green and blue, and hearing the gentle susurration of shingled shores, and feeling the good clean breeze blowing through the dusty pores of his body. Seabirds wheeled and screamed, their cries drifting down the air to him, their bodies minuting through the intricate, formal dances, suspended on curved, brave wings against the sky. Surprised, Elise said gravely. Yes, he decided to be honest. Yes, I am. I'd no idea. It's beautiful. It holds its secret well, she said cryptically. Above them, the sky was the faintest translucent shade of blue, so brilliant that the mere air glow hurt their eyes. The shining bowl seemed to surge away from them and, recurving, swoop in towards their feet, so that the heavy green grass and rich earth of the cliff seemed suspended in an exquisite, precious and infinite globe of diluted light. With a feeling almost of trespass, he began to follow Elise down the curved pathway to the foot of the cliffs. He'd seen the seas of earth as few had seen them, gleaming mottled on the vast bulk of the planet, rushing up as his frail rocket fell headlong towards them. That had been a grand and wonderful experience, giving him, for a magic moment, a sense of superiority, of dispassionate calm removed from the troubles of the world. But this was on a different plane together. This sense of wonder that pervaded him now was his birthright, something that his ancestors had taken in joy for thousands of years, taken for granted, taken and moulded as their temperaments directed. And he, a child of Earth, was seeing it for the first time. He began to appreciate an inkling of Elise's reaction to the Space Force, and then he shrugged off the whole mood and looked about him as he might have done stepping down from the landing ramp of his ship on any strange and alien planet. The beach was an almost perfect arc of white sand. The sea laved it caressingly, without rancor, as though the titanic power of Neptune had been bridled and harnessed. Staring out to sea, he could just make out the long, low dam, which made that a fact, and no longer a fancy. This whole area of water before him was fenced off from the turbulence of the ocean. Across its bosom scuttled yachts, trim shapes with pouter pigeon spinnakers and stiff scraps of coloured bunting at their trucks. Catamarans ploughed railway lines of foam, and laughing people swallow-tailed in the wake of speedboats, miraculously supported on fragile skis that threw back the light of the sun in golden slivers of speed. Swimmers were everywhere. Their tanned arms flashed above the waves. Dodge saw with dumbfounded amazement a tot of no more than a year. Certainly the little fellow could never yet have walked, calmly butterflying along and leaving a neat, precise wake of regularly spaced whirlpools. He shook his head and followed Elise onto the beach. On the beach were 6 wooden shacks, painted in pastel colours, and with bright beach balls and water skis and aqua floats, and peddlers scattered casually around them. Dodge looked. His mouth tightened up. "Miss Tarrant, I came here to see Mr. Grosvenor. I do not see any hotel." She gestured casually out towards the horizon. Dodge, impelled more by something within himself he could not explain than the pointing arm, looked. Now that he stared closely, he could see bulges at intervals along the top of the mammoth seawall. And there were other dark island specks here and there in the waters. But there was nothing which he could recognize as a hotel. "Well," he said, trying not to put too much acidity into his voice. He had to remember that he wasn't ordering a space cruiser's crew about. "I fail to see a hotel." "It's out there, Commander," she said abstractedly. She had her head back and was squinting her eyes against the glare. She made an interesting profile. Dodge was more concerned, just at the moment, with finalizing this business and getting back to the moon. He said, "You dragged me out here, promising me I'm going to meet Mr. Mystery Man Grosvenor at the Blue Deep Hotel, and what He stopped. His mouth remained open foolishly. He swallowed. "Blue Deep," Dodge said. His voice was a squeak. He swallowed again and pointed out to sea. "Blue Deep? Under the sea? Oh no, I'm not getting wet for you or 20 Grosvenors." She laughed a little shamefacedly. "It's not blue, as you can see, and it's not at all deep," she dimpled. "I thought you knew. Really, I did. You see," she added in a rush, "Mr. Grosvenor spends all his time under, that is, all his time near here, and is such a busy man that it saves him a lot of time if he sees people at the Blue Deep. Neither of you have to come all the way then, you see," she finished practically. Dodge couldn't get the hang of that at all. He said threateningly, "You're not enticing me to go down in dratted submarine. The things are dangerous." "Did you rocket out to Jupiter?" "Yes, but that's different. We've organized..." Well, don't you think that the Navy have organized too?" Dodge knew quite well that he was putting on an act and that any fears he had were quite unconnected with the mere fact of going under the sea. There was something very much adrift with his whole orbit. He sensed that, but quite naturally he didn't know what. If he did now, well, he might go along with it, but just for the company of Miss Elise Tarrant. Yeah, he might, at that. He persevered with the chit-chat. "When you're in a spaceship, you've got the stars for company. When you're in a submarine, you've only yourself. And sister, that's bad." She wasn't listening. She had her hands up shading her eyes and was peering into the sky again. Dodge looked up. A bloated cigar of shining silver nosed daintily over the edge of the cliff and sailed out over the beach, gradually dropping towards the sand. A rope snaked from a cabin slung underneath, forward and aft, and the whirling propellers on either side slowed, became visible and stopped. The airship touched down. Laughing holiday makers from the sands mixed with the ground crew tailing on the landing ropes. Everything seemed to be run on casual, democratic, no fuss, no rush lines. No one appeared to give orders, and yet the ship was streamlined into the wind, a ramp slid down and the passengers tumbled off. Children were gambling around, jumping up and down excitedly as their parents hauled a rope or handled the gangplank. "That's an airship," Dodge said in a strangled voice. "I thought they were deadlier than the galleys." "Come on." Elise began to walk, sliding and plunging in the sand towards the airship. "I thought we might have missed it. We're just in time." Dodge didn't argue. He was past that. If this sprite of a girl wanted him to stand on his head and recite the Walrus and the Carpenter, he probably would. Just for the laughs, though, he told himself sternly. Just for the laughs. The airship blossomed over his head as they came up to the ramp. A man with a straw Panama hat, a blue naval uniform jacket over bathing trunks and sandals, smiled at them as they went aboard. They stood by a slanting window, watching the other people from the train coming aboard or making for the bar. No one asked them for a ticket or for money. Presently, the ship lifted off, waved away by the happy bathers below, and slanted out towards the sea. Dodge had noticed the words, 12 feet high, so he'd just been able to read them on the flanks of the Zeppelin. Blue Deep Hotel, best water in 7 seas. "How come the hotel runs an airship?" he asked. They were sitting in the lounge by a window, the sea a glittering carpet of green and violet and blue below. "We could have taken a helicopter or a flying carpet, or we could have gone by launch," Elise said matter-of-factly. "But the blimp happened to be scheduled next, and I happen to like riding her. I like the sensation." "Dirigible, not blimp," Dodge said automatically. "Rigid construction, all right. Why not a submarine?" "You won't get your ears wet, Commander. The hotel extends into the air, rising from the seabed, and you can descend right to the floor in air. It's most convenient." "I happen to like breathing air," Dodge said. He meant it. Most of his pals who tried to breathe space had not come home to tell him about it. "How long do we take?" 15 minutes, it's not long." "I still can't get over the idea of an underwater hotel running an airship for guests. It's all mixed up." Elise favoured him with one of her rare smiles. "One word," she said sweetly. "Helium." Dodge understood then, of course, that it was a neat idea. We use helium in space, and divers and such use it to stop getting drunk, isn't it? And this ship makes a grand emergency reservoir. Not all emergencies either. They replenish from the ballonets when necessary, and the ship tanks up when she returns to the shore. Oh, and it's good publicity too. She crinkled her nose, a gesture that Dodge was beginning to recognize. "How come you know about getting drunk?" He tried to look injured, playing the gay insouciant under the conditions of fresh experiences and a full sense of living. And a beautiful girl. Was not at all difficult. "Drunk? Me? I am strictly TT, miss, I'll have you know." She didn't smile, though she said, "I meant about your knowing that divers get drunk if they go too deep, if they didn't use helium." Dodge happened to be following out the corner of his eye the creamy wake of a double-decked catamaran below, and the craft swept out of sight below the window directly above Elisa's hand, lying on the arm of her chair. Dodge saw that hand clench as she spoke, the knuckles go tallow white and shiny. "Why?" he said without betraying his growing unease in the odd little facets of this affair. "We had a job out on the Hartston Reef on Venus one time. The old Arkan went in with all jets blasting. Did a bit of salvage, adapting space gear. We knew about the effects of nitrogen, narcosis and pressure illness. We used to call it the bends, but that's all. So you do know something of the undersea world, she said thoughtfully. For a moment I thought, oh, well, never mind, we're here. Dodge leaned forward over the table. You thought I might be putting up a front, didn't you, Miss Tarrant? You thought I might not be Commander Jeremy Dodge, didn't you? You thought I might be someone else. Chapter 2. Her reaction was shocking. Her face drained of colour, leaving suddenly noticeable rings of purple beneath her eyes and lines of strain he had not noticed before. Her little gasp was not stopped as the tip of her tongue flicked into sight between her teeth. She was badly frightened. Then she had recovered. She brushed a quick hand through her dark hair, tossing her head back, rising to her feet, completely in control of herself again. But Dodge wasn't fooled. His suspicions crystallized. This girl was living under the weight of an oppressive fear. It had glared from her eyes in that moment of shocked unguardedness. And whatever she was frightened of was bad medicine for Jeremy Dodge. Of that he was completely certain. It behooved him to be watchful. The airship had been fastened to a mooring mast, and now lay snuggled against it, head to wind like an infant at a feeding tube. They descended with the other passengers, this time in a smooth hydraulic lift. Dodge felt amazed at the casual tempo of life. Things got done, fast and efficiently, but there was no fuss, no shouting, no hallooing of orders and questions and counter-suggestions. It didn't seem to matter who did what. Everything was performed good-naturedly and with a ready smile. Jokes flew thick and fast. If this was life on Earth, outside the cities, it seemed the best place possible for anyone to be. Dodge realized that this was the lack of strain. In space, every moment might bring abrupt, awful danger. Here, on the quiet Earth, people could go about their daily tasks without that ever-present sense of impending doom. You could be happy on Earth. It was quite a revelation. And against that bright background lay the stain of a girl's secret fear. On the landing platform he turned towards the horizon, one hand still on the guardrail, feeling the breeze against his body and wondering just how near the retaining wall of the artificial lake the hotel lay. He looked across the long, smooth swell of the open sea, empty and rolling under the sky. Clouds massed above like serrated leaves, and a few birds skimmed low over the rollers. He whirled fast. The wall lay a few hundred yards towards the shore, cutting off much of the lake from view. The white cliffs looked impossibly remote, like a streaming tail of cloud above the water. I told you it was called the Blue Deep, Elise said, realizing Dodge's reactions. It's in the open sea, although on this coast that's as safe as behind the chicken wire. Dodge let that pass. They went down into the hotel depths. The building was a ring, 200 yards across, built upon the solid rock of the seafloor. Its 4 upper stories and the landing platform above the waves, the rest of its bulk wrapped in 250 feet of water. The walls were transparent, and cunning lighting fixtures had been positioned outside, so that a deep green luminescence filled the descending spiral of the stairways surrounding the inner lobbies and rooms and restaurants. People swarmed everywhere, and yet there was not that insufferable crush that Dodge had experienced with irritation in the city. Men and women wearing only the briefest of trunks and bras and transparent capes moved leisurely up and down. Many carried swimming flippers and face masks. Tiny children, stark naked, ran and squealed and queued up in fighting bundles for preference at the airlocks up and down the hotel's walls. Husky, broad-shouldered, good-looking youths, with lifeguards stenciled all over them, tried to instill some discipline into the kids, and others marshalled parties equipped with slingshots and spring guns and compressed harpoons for underwater hunting expeditions. Studious-looking highbrows wandered about with a profusion of camera and sketching equipment, waterproofed for underwater use. Giggling girls who were clearly and so rightly prime exponents of the Back to Nature movement waved to friends gliding gracefully past the window outside. Out there, a bubbling, squirming, contorting class of neophytes was going through its paces under the eyes of watchful instructors. Elise sniffed scornfully. "Even though this is a make-believe deep-sea hotel," she said disdainfully, "at least it is more adventurous than those within the chicken wire, and that's where those dry necks belong." From the airlock protruded the stern of a submarine, with excited passengers taking their places within. "Joyrides around the reef," said Elise. They passed into a wide hall where comfortable foam plastic chairs were ranged before a single vast sheet of clear plastic led into the outside wall. Throbbing music permeated the warm air. Outside in the limpid water, whole chorus lines of girls were going through their routine, their liquid bodies flowing through the water as though part of it. They were wearing gleaming, reflecting tinsel costumes, and the patterns they created were almost hypnotic. Dodge had to tear his eyes away and follow Elise through the rear of the auditorium. This wasn't just a new life. This was a whole new world. At the reception desk flooded in mellow, artificial light. Elise spoke to the girl. The receptionist had red hair, and its coiffed waves were interlaced with seashells and pearls and starfish. Everywhere Dodge looked, the motif was one of marine life. Etched into plastic wall panels, moulded around lamp fittings, painted in sweeping frescoes on the ceilings, patterned in the rugs, all the mysterious life of the sea was illuminated and invigorated by a master hand. "Oh dear," Elise said, turning to Dodge. "I'm sorry, Commander. Mr. Grosvenor has gone on a hunt. He wasn't expecting you until later, you know." "I don't know." Dodge felt annoyed. "Well, how long will he be?" She didn't flush, but her eyebrows arched fractionally. As she spoke, Dodge felt a heel. "He has gone with an inner wall party to watch a new consignment of Dentex. That's a small carnivorous fish, and they may be out for some time. There's a chance that they will go on a hunt in one of those preserves." Dodge nodded grumpily and spotted a passing waiter. He attracted the man's attention, trying not to be disconcerted by his waiter's uniform of bathing trunks and black bow tie. "Bring me a whiskey, please," he said. Elise spoke quickly. I wouldn't, Commander." Dodge was dumbfounded. "What goes on here, Miss Tarrant? Are you some sort of wet nurse or something? Look, I'm not a habitual drunk. I can drink a single whiskey now and again without ill effects, you know." He couldn't resist adding, "Your Honor, will still be safe. As soon as he said it, he wished he didn't. Thankfully, though, she let it ride. Look, Commander, there's a small underwater chalet out where Mr. Grosvenor is hunting. I know you're in a hurry. Dodge grunted at this. So I suggest we both fly out there now. We can catch an aquaplane easily. For a moment, Dodge considered. Alright, you've brought me this far on this will-o'-the-wisp chase. I might as well go the full distance. What is this aquaplane? She dimpled. You'll see. If you'll register, you'll have to stay the night now. We can go straight to the dressing rooms and airlock. I have a room there. After he had purchased a pair of swimming trunks and been shown to his room where he found a standard of comfort he had not expected, he changed and went quickly through the other residents to the dressing rooms, conscious of his space pallor. His white skin stood out like a lump of chalk in a poppy field. The dressing room was an oblong chamber, with one side studded with the inner valves of airlocks. The opposite wall contained a long counter, behind which stood attendants and racks of flippers, face masks, underwater hunting weapons, cameras, lines, all the impedimenta that a person might want to take to the sea. A helpful attendant was quickly persuaded by Dodge that a commander in the Space Force knew all about living under alien conditions, and that he had no need of special tuition. Dodge hired a pair of plastic flippers and put them on gingerly, trying to appear nonchalant. He was just reaching forward to take a face mask when a cool voice came from the region of his right ear. All right to go, Commander. Good. He turned. He had enough shocks this day to last him quite a time, but he experienced nothing to compare with this. What he saw convinced him that he had been wasting his time in space. He should have been with Elise Tarrant a very long while ago. A very long while indeed. A panicky thought crossed his mind. Suppose she were married. She was smiling at him, and he saw at once that she was just a little uneasy at the impression she was creating. Her bathing costume was a brilliant, livid scarlet. It consisted of a narrow string supporting a wedge-shaped flame of scarlet and 2 small cups of scarlet plastic. It hid just enough to rank as clothes, and did what clothes always can do to a woman. As for the rest of Miss Tarrant, well, Dodge passed a dry tongue across his lips and became slowly aware that she was, at last, blushing. He took his eyes, that felt as though they were on stalks, away and mumbled something about being sorry, and then realized sinkingly that that made it worse. He searched frantically for something to say. Picking up the face mask, he said inanely, Where are the air cylinders? Elise seized the change of conversations. Dodge's silent admiration had been all the more vocal for being dumb, and busily pulled forward her own mask. She pointed to the cheek pieces. These are the cylinders. We use spun glass fibre and plastic, much stronger than steel for holding compressed gases, and the pressure is a lot of atmospheres. They don't use liquid oxy up here. The pressure demand regulator here. She touched the round machine box at the nape of the mask fastenings. Is a quadruple effect regulator. Brings that pressure of air in the flask down through 4 stages until it reaches the pressure of the surrounding water. Then you breathe it. She had talked out the byplay, and now Dodge felt more composed. It was a hell of a jolt to turn around to see a girl like that at your elbow. He wished he knew more about her. Some of the things she said would bear closer inspection. How could this hotel be up here? He looked at the cheek pieces, saw that they were running small cylinders with reinforced corrugated tubes, running from either side, to a mouthpiece with a rubber grip for teeth. The attendant, a husky Negro with a grin that split his face in two, and a torso that could have held Atlas and the world, had watched the meeting of Ellis and Dodge, and now he coughed discreetly. Dodge remembered that he was supposed to be an underwater expert. He tried to be clever. "In the Space Force we have the intake and mask in one," he said loftily. "None of this gripping onto it with your teeth, frightened to spit it out." Elise jumped in with both flippers. "The Space Force work all under nil pressure," she said, twisting the mask in her hand. "Carbon dioxide exhaled through the nose goes vicious under pressure and hangs around poisoning you. So we make the places where it can collect as small as possible. That's why." Dodge felt as small as he knew he deserved to feel. He turned away from the counter and began to walk towards the airlock. "Your radio, sir," the attendant said in his melodious southern voice. Dodge picked up the little transceiver and then went off stumbling in the flippers, and allowed Elise to show him how it fitted onto the mask. A simple throat microphone and amplifier connected to a diaphragm, which would be in direct contact with the water. He reckoned that it would be good for a few feet communication submerged. With the understanding that you couldn't keep up a sustained conversation with a mouthpiece between your lips, he was beginning to see that there was more to this sub-aqua stuff than he had realized. He had previously thought that you simply transferred proved space techniques underwater, but he had to admit that there was more to it than that. It was the pressure. They'd found out a bit about that on the Hartshorn Reef on Venus. When his gear was stowed all about him, they didn't take harpoon guns, much to Dodge's secret disappointment. He went with Elise over the airlocks. They waited their turn, and as they were stepping over the wet gratings, Elise suddenly took his arm and spoke softly into his ear. "Oh, Commander, I should have warned you. The water may be a trifle cold to you. We're going inside the chicken wire and they warm it up there with a network of heaters along the bottom. If you just let yourself go and strike out with your feet, we'll soon be in the warm." Then the valve had closed at their backs and the water began to rise around their feet. The 6 other people in the locks, young couples, were already skylarking around. "Warm the water? That must be quite an engineering proposition," Dodge summed up, trying to distract his mind from the air that he was sucking into his mouth, and the slight pressure of the mask, and the weight of the gear, and most especially of the water rising inexorably around his thighs and stomach and chest. It seemed an age before the outer lock opened and that they were through. Immediately outside was a caged platform, and here attendants, masked and flippered like themselves, attached weights and adjusted their buoyancy. Dodge just hung in the water. It was cold. Damned cold. Goose Pimples started up at once, telling Dodge that his first layer of insulation had gone down. He thrashed with his legs and shot forward. Elise's voice, faintly amused, came bubbling out clearly through the water. "You're going the wrong way, Commander. Over here." He tried to turn and felt the mask biting into his face. She must have spotted this. "Breathe out from your nose. That'll equalize the pressure and stop the mask cutting off your face." He did so, and the pressure vanished. He waggled his flippers. Sensations attacked him from all sides simultaneously. The feeling of floating, of being buoyed up, was quite familiar to a man who had lived out weeks of freefall. But he ran into one profound difference immediately. He tried to flip himself round to face towards Elise, as he would have done in space. Everything happened except what he wanted. It felt as though he were trying to force himself through a planet-sized treacle tart with a child's pusher for weapon. He thrashed wildly with his arms, afraid to move his feet for fear of shooting off at some fresh impossible tangent. For one horrible moment, he had the feeling that he was buried alive. "Hold steady!" Elise's voice through the water was full of laughter, of impish hilarity. That acted like a tonic on Dodge. "Just let yourself hang, keep still, then we'll try some exercises." He refused to be needled. Obediently, he stopped moving. He knew enough about this business of pressure to swallow to clear his eustachian tubes, at least to open them so that air pressure could meet and balance outside water pressure on his eardrums. So far, he hadn't spoken a word. Now, he articulated through the throat mic. "How deep are we?" Elise had a depth meter strapped to her wrist. She said without looking at it, 40 feet, nothing at all, except for pressure variations. "Now, if you'll just lie like a log, I'll tow you across to an aquaplane. There's one just ready to go." Fuming, embarrassed by his own suddenly demonstrated incompetence, and yet annoyingly and humiliatingly pleased by the symbiotic feeling of the girl towing him in smooth, undulating surges through the water, Dodge relaxed and was towed. He had forgotten the last time he had felt so utterly helpless before purely physical conditions. It was all a trick, of course, a matter of adjustment. His almost symbiotic relationship with spatial conditions, leading to an automatic reaction, had betrayed him here in this underwater realm. He'd learn. The aquaplane was a hydrodynamic wing surface, with rudder and diving planes controlled by a joystick. The pilot reclined in the center of the controls. From the trailing edges of the wing, lengths of rope were hanging, with ring handles at their ends. Already 2 or 3 couples had hung on, looking like trapeze artists warming up for the show. Elise deftly slid sideways, freeing Dodge, and all in the same motion, thrusting a pair of rings into his hands. He grasped them, watching her take the adjacent pair and turn a laughing face towards him. Laughing? Yes, she blew a big bubble of air at him and then replaced her mouthpiece. Big joke. Great fun. Dodge turned his face mask the other way sourly, and watched as the pilot fiddled with his controls. As Elise and he had hooked on, the pilot glanced to his rear, then looked forward again. The cable, which looped from the aquaplane's bow and disappeared upwards into colour-shot haze, shivered into sinuous length, straightened, and then as the aquaplane gathered momentum, relaxed again into its graceful curve. The whole travelling circus moved through the water, towed, Dodge surmised, by a motorboat on the surface above their heads. To his left, the water was a glowing sheet of colour from the levels of the hotel windows and the outside lights. Its transparency surprised him. Somehow, underwater, he had expected to see and be continually reminded of the liquid element. He found that it was like space in that he saw through it, and the objects within his field of vision attracted his attention far more than the substance, or lack of it, in which they were embedded. Seeing was particularly good. His spirits began to rise as he felt the forward motion of his body, balancing the unease he felt, occasioned not by the irrational feeling of pressure on his body. He was under a pressure of 3 atmospheres down here, but for all the feeling of difference it made, it could have been 33. He suddenly felt bad at snubbing Elise, and turned to her. He was about to phrase a carefully non-committal sort of remark, when he felt the forward movement of his body pulling him up on the aquaplane. The lights of the hotel had vanished. Before him reared a huge rectangle of yellow light, outlining a smaller oval of light The aquaplane slowed before the oval, which Dodge saw indistinctly was the entrance to a tunnel. Elise said sharply, "Double up and decelerate, Commander. We're going through the lock." How it was done, Dodge didn't know. One moment he was freezing in the open sea, the next he was blindly following the aquaplane, with its tow rope sliding through a slit in the roof and emerging into a brightly lit area where the water was of a heavenly warmth. He shivered in involuntary reaction. The pilot glanced behind again. Then a number of small plane-shaped rectangles of plastic drifted back on lines from the wing. Elise shook her head. The next pair of rings supported a young Siamese girl. She caught the horizontal bar of the plane, released the rings, and then swept away behind the aquaplane. Dodge lay over his side to watch. The girl handled the little plane superbly. She twisted the bar, the plane dipped, and she went swooping down until all that Dodge could see was the descending rope. Then she rose into vision again, hair a flying cloud as she braked and turned her triangular face towards her companion. He took off in a second plane, rising and falling in a series of controlled plunges. The girl tried a complicated maneuver to avoid him, and the next second they were both spiraling and spinning away beyond the limits of vision. "It's grand fun, Commander, but you're in a hurry, you say." "That's right. Is it much further?" "Not far. This water is all plankton free. They like it like that for clarity. But they have to provide food for the fish at regular intervals." She pointed with one hand. "Otherwise the fish wouldn't stay around. Over there you'll see the wires soon. Preserves, various kinds, hunting, photography, breeding, all very scientific." At odd moments they passed spheres of light, suspended in the water by their own balanced buoyancy. It was as light as day beneath the surface. It was all very pleasant, very refreshing, very exciting really. And yet Dodge could not throw off that feeling of depression, of savage refusal to accept things at their face value, a mood almost of masochism. Just sour grapes, he supposed, because Elise was so perfectly at home underwater and had no hesitation about helping him like a lame dog, which was pretty thick when he thought about it. Out in space, with a clear, clean sweep of the stars for company, he could feel at home. Down there, paddling around like a shrimp in a pool, he felt shut off, trapped. With all his freedom of movement and a knowledge of the vastness of the oceans, he had a strong sensation of claustrophobia. Get this interview over with, and he'd have his bath walled up and use the shower from now on. Elise waved to the pilot and said to Dodge, "Let's go, Commander. We're here. Keep your body still and just waggle your feet up and down. I'll guide you." Manfully, Dodge did not reply, but did as he was directed. Rather, to his own surprise, he found himself moving after Elise, a little uncertainly true, and with many a wobble and convulsion to regain his original direction. But he was proceeding and learning. Elise caught the wire, close-meshed and triple reinforced, hung on and waited for him. She was looking all about her, expectantly, Dodge thought. He could see no sign of an opening, and was just about to inquire sarcastically whether she thought he could emulate an eel as well as a fish, when 3 dark shadows slipped down towards him. For a single instant, panic threatened to whelm him. Then he recovered shakily as he saw Elise's vivid scarlet bathing costume in almost its true brilliant colour, from a drifting globe of yellowish white light. The shadows resolved into men with face masks, flippers, and harpoon guns. They swam, Dodge saw, with prodigious ease, swinging high over Elise and swooping down towards her. She lifted her hand. The men, by some subtle shift of direction, angled towards him. Fractionally, as they surged towards him like 3 torpedoes homing on an unwanted asteroid, he caught sight of something he did not understand and could not believe. Then the first man had grasped Dodge's arms, the second his legs, and the third raced in towards his side. Dodge shouted, got a mouthful of water, and felt his mouthpiece thrust clumsily back into position. He felt the prick in his arm quite distinctly. Hypodermic. Even then, some wayward thought tried to work out the pressure-resistant qualities a hypo would need for underwater use. Even as the answer that it was easy came, he felt the first surges of blackness taking over. He tried to move his legs, his arms, but they were weighted with all the lead on the moon. Sparks swam across his eyes. He felt a grip tighten across his chest. Just before the final blackness and deep oblivion came down like a night on Mercury, he saw what he had not believed was true. These 3 men had face masks over their eyes, but they didn't have any air tanks that he could see. There were no mouthpieces in their mouths, and those mouths were wide open to the sea water. Dodge, firmly convinced that he was having a nightmare, blacked out.